Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today, I've got Mark and Richard with me, and Michael. Thanks for joining me, guys. We've got a couple of topics today. The main one is going to be a poll that was conducted by YouGov in the United States, which found that a fifth of Americans between 18 and 29 um, thought that the Holocaust was a myth, and there's some other statistics there as well, but which basically reflect a growing skepticism amongst younger people about the Holocaust, whether it actually happened, and so on and so forth. And we're going to talk about that, what we think about it, and what we think it says. And then as the second topic as well, we're also going to talk about the ongoing COP28 summit, what we think about that, what we think about what's been said there, what we think about Greta Thunberg, of course, and all this kind of stuff, right? So let's start with the poll. YouGov is this polling agency which is very famous in the UK. I don't know if it's famous in the US as well, but basically one of the government ministers who was influential in the last few years, Nadeem Zahawi, was one of the guys who founded it, got fantastically rich off it. And it's generally taken as an authoritative polling company. And they polled people, asking them the question, do you think the Holocaust is a myth? And in the age brackets 18 to 29, as I said, 20% responded yes, that they thought it was a myth. And 30% that they didn't agree or disagree with the idea that it was a myth, basically saying they were unsure. And then what was interesting is that the older the recipients got, the less skepticism there was. So for over 65s, 0% agreed that it was a myth, and only 2% said they weren't sure. And this is really interesting. And I think it has to say something impactful about something that's going on in the minds of young people, I think. Michael, you're actually in the US. One, what do you think about this? But does this tally up with your experience of people 18 to 29?
I don't have a lot of experience with people 18 to 29. So I mean, in the big house, there's a lot of this kind of stuff, conspiracy theories, and I run into a lot of it online. It doesn't surprise me that would be happening. Just the conspiracy theory industry seems to have just exploded. And I don't know what to do about it, or I don't know how to talk to conspiracy theorists. If you talk to somebody, for instance, you take your Holocaust denier and you talk to him and you say, look, I can show you the information here, and then he just says, oh no, that's all from them, and that's from the regime, or that's from the establishment. You can't believe that. And it just comes down to they have the source that tells them what they want to hear, and that's the only one they're going to accept. And that's the only thing that I think explains it, is just the rise of conspiracy theories with the advent of social media.
I think there's something to that as well. And I want to talk as well. You mentioned the big house. I take it that's prison you're talking about, in prison.
The Huskow, yes.
Yeah. So why is that? Why in prison do you think that? Because there's more conspiratorial.
Well, there's a couple things. One, people in general, but especially in prison. So in prison, there's different cliques, groups of and I don't mean gangs. I mean people that study. Like you might have your Muslim group and in your Christian group, and then you have your conspiracy theory groups, and then those groups can be broken down into different things. And there's this desire, and I think that it's big out here also, where people want to be the ones who know the truth, the hidden truth that you don't know, that they're somehow privy to it, whereas you aren't. And they'll tell you they want you to know it, but really they don't, because if you knew what they know, then that takes away the aura they have of the self-importance. But I think there's also this drive to be a victim that we have. Well, I don't have it, but a lot of people in America have it. I'd imagine it's elsewhere, where people like to be viewed as victims, and the idea that the society or this secret cabal is sticking it to them, and that's why they can't get ahead, I think is very appealing. But it doesn't help when you have, for instance, Anthony Fauci does an interview on 60 Minutes and says nobody should be wearing masks. And then later on says, I just said that because I didn't want to start a panic. And he basically admitted he lied. There's no way around that. And then that lends credence to the idea that nobody in authority can be trusted. Similarly with when anybody would speculate that COVID came out of the Wuhan lab. and they said it's just a conspiracy theory. Well, there's some people think it could have. It hasn't been proven, of course. The majority still think that it came out of the wet market, but nonetheless, it's not such a crazy theory. But when the powers that be paint it as a crazy theory, now people feel validated. Wait a second, you said this was crazy. Now all of a sudden it isn't. So there's a lot of factors, I think, that go into this: a distrust of authority, a desire to feel important, a desire to be a victim, and they sort of just make a perfect storm for the kind of, and then when you throw in anti-Semitism into the mix, that's just, that just lights the match on the of the bomb.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just on a small part, I guess what was interesting, I think, about the lab theory is, I think everyone remembers when COVID was starting and people were discussing where it was coming from. Obviously, that kind of idea was dismissed very much as being conspiratorial. And in the UK, the Prime Minister's chief advisor at the time, Dominic Cummings, had written an article in like March 2019, where he said that we should be really concerned about coronaviruses and we should be really concerned about them leaking from labs in China. And it was this reviled, hated figure. So it was associated, and he's viewed as a crackpot. He's portrayed on TV as literally as an alien who wants to eat babies, right? And so it was kind of associated with that kind of wing of person. And then just, I think about a week or two ago, a government minister called Michael Gove was testifying to the inquiry into how the government handled lockdowns, and basically said that he thinks that it's come from a lab, and it's gone from conspiracy theory to mainstream opinion, sort of like that, which I think is interesting. But anyway, Marco and Richard, what do you think about this poll? And just the same thing, why do you think this is, especially amongst young people and then less so amongst older people?
First of all, it's not surprising that people over 65, 0% of them think it's a conspiracy, if anything else, because they were born up to 20 years after the events of World War II. So they would probably have, if not lived it, by some of their parents or somebody they knew, they would have been fairly close to the events. So it's not a surprise that somebody who was born 60 years later is totally forgotten this side of history. The issue here is that these kids, they're not supposed to know stuff if they're not taught about it. So the fault there is on the side of the generation who was supposed to educate them and show them, teach them about history, and show them what the proofs are. Take them to see museums, and if you are here in Europe, take them to visit concentration camps, most of which are actually museums nowadays. But that's a fault that it's on them. And then to talk about conspiracy theory, I'll mention it later on perhaps, but this whole thing it seems to be a perfect storm of cock-ups, really, rather than
yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that attracts people to conspiracy theories, or one of the key things, is what Michael was talking about there, which is the unearned prestige of thinking that you're part of some intelligent club without doing any individual thinking yourself, but just taking what a little secret group tells you, and you're privy to it and no one else is, and that makes you special and clever. That's the attraction to it. What I always find particularly interesting about those that take conspiracy theories automatically go against the standard narrative in any situation is that they're still all being led by the herd. They're just doing the opposite of what the herd, what the mainstream is all the time, but it's still the mainstream that's deciding what you think. You wait to find out what they think and you think the opposite, which is, ultimate lazy and dumb thinking in the first place. So you have to separate out each of the cases we're talking about. And I think a lot of what you say about COVID in particular is absolutely true. And the general state of politics and the fact that people are distrusting of politics, legitimately distrusting in many cases, and then illegitimately distrusting in other cases because they've got the experience of seeing lies exposed. So that doesn't help for sure.
Mm. So another part of the poll, which I thought was remarkable, was that they then asked these people whether they thought it was anti-Semitic to think that the Holocaust was a myth. So 20% of 18 to 29-year-olds thought it was a myth, and then 17% thought it wasn't anti-Semitic, which presumably leaves 3% who thought it was a myth and thought it was anti-Semitic and were happy to say it, which is sort of a shockingly high number. I know 3% is a small percentage, but that's still presumably leaving quite a lot of kids who think it's a myth and think, yeah, it's anti-Semitic, who cares? So Michael, I'll come back to you about America. So one thing that's notable, I guess, about the difference between the UK and America is that there's a much smaller population in the UK of Jews than there are in the US. So although I don't think it's in any way excusable, it's almost, in a way, the fact that there's anti-Semitism in the UK almost makes a certain kind of more sense in that people are much more liable to be ignorant of Jewish people, to have never really met a Jewish person and so on. But one of the things that I'm struck about in the US is that there's a lot of Jewish people around, and Jewish culture is much more normal, knowledge of Jewish holidays and things like this. So how do you think it is that this kind of anti-Semitism as well is able to spread in the US, where there's actually going to be, people are generally going to have a much more exposure, I think, to meeting Jewish people and to seeing that they're not, lizards who poison the world or whatever the crazy conspiracy theory is, right?
Well, within the conspiracy theories, Jews have been at the center of these things for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I don't ultimately know. I mean, other than just the ability to have a scapegoat for problems, I don't know what it's all about. I mean, there's the religious element, I suppose, and then there's the scapegoat element. But why it takes such hold, I really don't know. Part of the problem is like when Richard and Marco were talking about the education system, and I agree with that to an extent. The problem is let me say I agree with it. What I don't think, though, is that it's a matter of teaching facts. I think it's a matter of teaching how to think. That's where the problem comes in. And I'll give you an example. A guy I called the other day, I called Alex Jones a scumbag on Facebook. This guy's a scumbag. And somebody said to me, oh, well, you're just accepting the narrative of the powerful class or whatever. And I said, well, first of all, I'm going by what I've heard the guy say. But then I asked him, well, do you think that Anthony Fauci, Henry Kissinger, and I said somebody else, do you think these people are scumbags? He said, that's different. They're out in the public eye. The problem is they pick and choose which information they're going to accept. When the information is confirming their conspiracy, they're all about it. It's factual now. It's acceptable. When it doesn't, they disallow it. And as long as you have that dynamic going on in somebody's head, I don't know, like what I can't. It's so distant from how I think. I can't even fathom it. Like when I've come across it so many times in my life, and I'm like Charlie Brown with the football with Lucy. I don't know if you guys know what that is over in England, but I go for it shocks me every time. And it shouldn't shock me because so many people are like that, but it's just so unrelatable to me. But nonetheless, when people want to believe something, they believe it, and why they want to believe it, well, I have no idea.
Yeah, there's a good article by Ben Bayer that I think he published in the New Ideal Journal, which the Ayn Rand Institute puts out, about the nature of conspiracy theories, which is very good. And he speaks about Alex Jones as a good example of this kind of thing. And I guess the central point that he was making about conspiracy theories, which connects to objectivist philosophy, is that people who think conspiratorially are people who entertain the arbitrary, i.e. entertain things for which there's no evidence at all, and they're not even attempting to make a connection to the evidence. I think that connects to your point about being taught how to think, because if you have some kind of understanding of how you go about thinking, then that's not something that's you're going to be much less likely to fall foul of that kind of thing, right? And Daniel actually just messaged and said that all students in Slovakia are made to go visit Auschwitz. I think that would be a pretty good thing to do. Maybe less feasible for students in the US, but across Europe, I'm actually surprised that more students aren't made to go do that. For example, I mean, when I was at school, for example, it's not like we didn't do European trips. We did a trip. There's a very common kind of trip you do called the battlefields trip, where you go to mainland Europe and you go see the battlefields from the First World War. And you could very feasibly go and do that with concentration camps and things like that. Although that wouldn't be very, not that going to battlefields is fun or pleasing in any way, but it's an extra solemn kind of activity, I suppose. But Mark, I mean, so do you think that young people in the UK similarly suffer from this kind of thing? Because I guess Ben's point about the arbitrary is that as people are less interested in using reason, they're being more reliant on what people are telling them, kind of like you were saying, Richard. We should expect to see this increasing. So do you think that's happening over here as well?
Well, it's hard to gauge. The issue with accepting the arbitrary is also that people always expect the explanation to a fact to be much more complex than what it is. Usually, often people's minds are repelled when you give them a very simple explanation of something. So that they try and hide in conspiracy theories in order to create some sort of, in their mind, more reliable version of reality, if you like, and that's part of the issue. I don't know here in Britain, because we are in Europe. I'm not sure that there is that much disconnect between the war and the Holocaust and young people. I think to a certain extent, people are more aware here because Daniel is about 4 hours drive from Auschwitz. Here we're a bit further away, but we're not. It's so impossible for students to get to any concentration camp in Europe. So there's really no reason why there should be this kind of denial of reality. I'm not aware of such level of denial in Britain, but given how the education system is hitting these kids, I wouldn't be surprised if in the long term we're going to get there.
Excuse me. I think there's a lot of faith-based thinking all the time, and allegiances that are held by faith first. For example, people assume that America is bad because it's capitalist, and therefore they'll be prone to assume that things like 9/11 can't possibly be the victims of 9/11 because they're the bad guys to start with, and then they add into that any other tropes such as the Jews were warned before 9/11 not to go in that day, or any other such BS. And it's because their allegiances can't be challenged because they hold on to them from a faith-based position rather than a fact-thinking-based position, rather than something with an epistemological basis or a set of considered thinking steps back to a considered premise in the first place. So it's not surprising, therefore, that people adhere strongly to what doesn't challenge their whole way of assessing the world in any situation.
The 9/11 one's a good example of a conspiracy theory as well, because that's one that I think really took in a lot of people. One of the things I saw the other day on Medium, so I write on Substack and Medium, right? And so I read a lot of articles that people post on there, and one of them had the title, "It's right to compare 10/7, October the 7th, to 9/11." And I thought, oh, that's, that kind of took me in, because I guess that's a title I'm likely to agree with, right? And then the subtitle said, "They were both planned by the government to start a war." And then instantly I thought, okay, I see what that article was trying to say. And so that's a kind of, the 9/11 conspiracy theory is one that clearly still has at least some purchase on people's minds. And then what we've seen from October 7th is one, which I'm not sure how widespread it is, but that's basically expressed in that subtitle, which is the idea that this was planned by the Israelis, or the Israelis are overemphasizing it because they want to go kill all the Gazans or whatever, right? I guess one thing I want to ask, I guess I've raised this in a context which is disagreeable, but let's forget that for a moment. Have you guys ever been taken in by a conspiracy theory? Have you ever heard one and believed it? Michael, have you?
Not once I studied logic. No, I mean, when I was 19 or 20, I would have said anything about anything, not really believing it. Like, I thought the government created AIDS and, that sort of thing. But I wouldn't have made a strong argument for it. There's two things that I found interesting that we've been talking about here is, Morgan, you mentioned that they're basically skeptical, or they don't want to accept the official line to things. That's true. But what I find most interesting about conspiracy theorists isn't that, because anybody can be skeptical. Like someone could just throw their hands up and say, you know what, these people are liars, I'm not going to believe them. But they don't just do that. They then substitute a narrative. Like for 9/11, they won't just say, you know what, I don't believe what they're telling us. They then say the Jews were behind it, or Bush was behind it, and here's why. And like you said, October 7th, the Israelis were behind it, and here's why. In the case of COVID, it's not just enough to say, you know what, something's not right here. They then go on to say, well, this was designed in a lab and released to control us, and that type of thing. And the other thing is that it was either Marco or Richard, I'm sorry, I don't remember, mentioned the faith element here. And I've always thought, well, not, as long as I've been in contact with conspiracy theorists, that there's a very close connection to religion. And so there's this one conspiracy theory, it's called the sovereign being theory or something. I don't know, it's some wacky thing. Whereas if you reclaim yourself, you really are a sovereign individual and the government has no authority over you. And I knew a guy in prison who was doing a 60-year sentence for murder. And he started off, he bought a couple books and he bought into this thing. And he was convinced that if he figured out how to do this, they were going to have to let him out of prison. And when he would argue with people about it, it took on a religious sort of, what's the word I'm looking for when you're trying to convert somebody? I can't remember it here. I can't remember, but
fervor evangelism.
It's a fervor evangelism, like this in evangelistic tone. And he would get angry and he kept going. And every time he would buy a book, he would say, oh, I just have to buy one more book. This isn't providing me with the link. I need to keep going to proselytize. That's the word I was looking for. You have to keep going. There's another book to buy. And it just kept going. He spent like $1,800 on these books about this sovereign claim, sovereign individual claim that was obviously wacky. And I told him, I said, the idea that there's this powerful cabal out there, they can start wars, they can do whatever they want, and you're just going to go to them and show them the secret code, and they're going to say, okay, you got us, and let you go. It just didn't make any sense. But because of that faith that you talked about, he bought into it. And I've seen that, a lot of times with people.
Yeah, it's one of these things that conspiracy theories are very easy to make fun of in a way, for obvious reasons. But there is a kind of tragic element to them because they can kind of, I think, really take over some people's lives who are maybe troubled in some way. I mean, that guy spent $1,800, whatever, probably would have alienated his friends who he had in prison or whatever. It's a real shame, and people, I think, go out and destroy their relationships and careers sometimes by just putting people off, because they clearly come across kind of wacky. But Mark and Richard, same question. I mean, have you guys ever been taken in by a conspiracy theory? Maybe when you were younger, maybe when you were 18 to 29. Who knows?
I don't think I've ever been collectivist enough to be sucked in any theory and conspiracy theory. What I wanted to say is that from where I stand, I think looks to me like most of the crazy stuff actually comes from America rather than being generated here in Britain. And like Michael mentioned, I wonder if it's based on a more religious outlook that Americans have compared to Brits. Of course, we had some sort of crazy stuff during the COVID period, but I think most of it was actually coming from across the pond. All the UFO stuff. What's the other one? There's one that we came across recently. It's about like this reptilian race trying to take over the world. It's like, how can you even come up with this stuff? But all the 9/11 theories and all this kind of these weird things. We seem to just talk about them, but they don't seem to me that they originate from Britain. But I might be wrong.
I do dislike the tendency for people to chuck out the word conspiracy theory in the same way they chuck out the word fake news as a way of shutting down people doing any legitimate analysis of anything that's going on. And I think that was definitely prevalent during the whole COVID and lockdown and how COVID was treated period of time. So do I buy into conspiracy theories? Well, I don't necessarily buy into the whole narrative I'm sold at the time. I'm questioning it along the way. and I think legitimately so. And as time's gone on, even more so, I'm comfortable with the red flags that I could see in terms of the narrative that I was being fed. Now, I'm being very general there, and we could get into details whether we're talking about masks or how you test for COVID or the origin of the virus or any of those kind of things. So, but that's a unique, more fresh issue. What I think's interesting about that some of the false flag stuff that you were talking about earlier, where something is claimed to be a fake event in order to allow governments to do something in response to it. I think one of the issues there is that people have very limited understanding of intelligence gathering and how it works for people like MI6 and people like that. For example, there's going to be so much information about potential terrorist attacks all the time to a huge extent. And within that, most of them will come to nothing. But when an event does happen, and then you have to retrospectively look back at what flags were there, what hints were there that this was going to happen, and you know what you're looking for then, and drawing out of the haystack what was known prior to the event and what was missed prior to the event, you've then got something was missed prior to the event, then the event happened. Now, people treat that as people knew in advance and ignored it, or and then the event went ahead. But it's just a misunderstanding of the complexity of the situation when it comes to analysing the constant threats that occur in any Western country.
Yeah. So Alex Jones comes to mind again, because I think one of the best, in the sense of amusing conspiracy theories ever, is the one that the Clintons was intergalactic psychokinetic child molesting vampires, right? That's like such a wonderful combination of things to believe is going on. And if you say to a conspiracy theorist this kind of thing that we've been saying, typically what I think they'll do is either, because they're entertaining the arbitrary, they'll say, well, prove me wrong, or they'll try and bring up examples of things in history which have been real conspiracies. And so I'll say people do conspire if what that means is people plan to do something which and they plan to do it in secret. And so they'll point to things like the Bay of Pigs invasion or MK Ultra or something like that, where you could, like, as far as I'm aware, they did actually test LSD on people, and governments have like tried to secretly do something malicious at some point, which is actually quite not that amazing a thing. So that in that sense, a conspiracy can happen. But the point about conspiracy theories is that the reason why it is, rather than just a conspiracy, it's conspiracy theory, is that it's asking you to basically take it on faith, like you were saying. And I think the point you were getting at, which is something I agree with, which is the concomitant kind of flip side of this, is that you get people who want to entertain the arbitrary and so become conspiracy theorists. And then you get people who aren't taken in by it, but they're basically taken in by appeals to authority. So you got that around COVID, right? You get some people flipping to the conspiratorial side of things, and then some people who will kind of just believe anything that they're told, so long as it's coming from an expert, quote unquote, or from the government. And basically the problem with both of these people is that they're not trying to bring their minds in contact with reality. One person is basically suspending the need from doing that altogether, so the arbitrary, and the other person is just relying on what someone else has said. And just as I think what you see is a growing tendency towards conspiracy amongst people, as the decline in thinking, reason, being trained in logic, as you said, Michael, you'll also see people relying more on appeals to authority as well. So I think that's very true. Anything else to say about conspiracy theories? Or
I do real quickly. I think of conspiracy theories, because it's true, you don't want to just be dismissive of people. I think of conspiracy theories more in terms of method. I mean, obviously there has to be a conspiracy that is being asserted, but it's the method of thinking that goes into it. A friend of mine told me one time that he said, it had to do with Fox News. He said Fox News is owned by BlackRock and Vanguard, and so are the Dominion voting machines. And he said, therefore, when Dominion sued Fox, they were just suing themselves. So I said, wow, that's interesting. I went and looked it up. It wasn't true. And so I told him, I said, hey, this isn't true. He said, well, where did you find it? I said, well, I Googled it. Oh, no. You can't use Google. can't. I said, oh, okay, well, where should I look? He said, you got to go to DuckDuckGo. I went to DuckDuckGo. It told me the same exact thing Google told me. So I told him, okay. And then he said, no, you got to keep digging. And I told him, why do I feel like I have to keep digging until I find the answer that you want me to see? And that, in my experience, is the method of conspiracy theorists. Is they dismiss any evidence that goes against them as part of the conspiracy, and any evidence that confirms them as sacrosanct. And the one, and along these lines, as far as going to visit Auschwitz, or I hope I said that right, Auschwitz, yeah. If somebody with this mentality were to go to Auschwitz as a kid, they would just say, this is, this is staged. They've made this for our benefit. They just want us to see it this way. That stuff never really happened. You could show them footage and they would say it's a movie. It really doesn't matter, because they're hell bent on believing what they want.
Well, that's a good point, actually, because although I think maybe visits to Auschwitz might help in general, I think that's a fair point. There's a notable example in the UK, which I've mentioned before, is that there's a historian called David Irving who has been to Auschwitz and basically denies that the gas chambers were ever there. And he's got this whole explanation of kind of diagrams of the gas chambers and why they don't make sense and why there's never any pictures of it. And he was alleged to be like a charlatan by an American historian called Deborah Lipstadt in a book published by Penguin. And in London, he took Penguin to court, and there was this big trial about it in the 90s, which was really brilliantly made into a film called Denial, which, if anyone wants to watch a movie this evening, go watch Denial. It's fantastic. And it basically dramatizes the trial. And what the trial ends up being is the British legal system ruling on whether the Holocaust actually happened or not, which is sort of a very interesting thing, because the way British libel works is you have to prove, it's the opposite of the US. You have to prove that you were legitimate in what you said or something. It's like the weird way. So they end up having to try and prove that the Holocaust happened. But anyway, Mark and Richard, anything final to say on this topic?
Well, funny enough, you just mentioned the case about the Holocaust. Recently, the lady who actually won the case and showed how the Holocaust effectively occurred was Heather Rogers, who died a few weeks ago. She was in the 60s. We actually knew her. She was our neighbor in a previous place. But to go back what you were saying, I mean, the problem with the conspiracy theory is that, as Morgan mentioned, it is the prove me wrong kind of culture, isn't it? People feel they can say what they want, and it's up to us to prove that they're wrong. When actually it's exactly the way around. The onus of the proof on the person who makes the statement. But that's the wrong epistemology and the wrong way of knowing how to know, which has not been taught in schools or anywhere really.
I think a culture of short attention spans and superficial understanding, and obviously that exemplified by but not caused by social media, is a classic case where you're likely to take a slogan as in not all you need to know on any given subject, and that's going to lead you epistemologically down a blind alley. And also, when it comes to the teaching of history, it's a lack of understanding of the value of history and the point in learning history in the first place. And the way that history is taught is so sporadic, it's so disjointed, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, here, there, and everywhere, from all sorts of different eras and geographies. And therefore, there's not the linking together of the principles and the understanding underneath, which explains why you need to learn history in the first place, so that you've got some understanding of what you face in the future and how it relates to the same principles you would have faced in the past, and therefore what you can learn from it. All of that is at play in this disjointed mess of accepting on faith what you read or hear or see.
So just before we go on to the next topic, we have a super chat for $2 from Maribin, so thank you so much. And she asked whether, how exactly does she put it? She puts it, does adoration of the NHS count as a conspiracy buy-in? Marco and Richard, I guess you guys can have that one. Does adoration of the NHS count as a conspiracy?
Can it be a conspiracy if almost everyone believes it? or is it simply mainstream? It doesn't mean it's not wrong, because it is wrong, but it's so widely held that that's more an expression of the ludicrous altruism that is we're marinated in the UK. So I don't think you could call that a conspiracy theory, but there is a wall of protectionism when it comes to challenging it and any aspects of it. So it's got those elements to it where you're not allowed to question why did all these babies die in these hospitals? Why was this occurring here? Why is such a statistic for such a given disease better treated in other parts of the world than here? All of those questions are steered away from or largely closed off. So in that sense, it's quite self-protective and doesn't want you to inquire. But that doesn't necessarily make it a conspiracy theory. It just makes it the wrong way of doing medicine.
Yeah, it's just another expression of our irrational times, the kind of irrationality we're living through. It's just...
Yeah, for sure. So for our second topic today, we're going to chat a little bit about the COP28 summit, which is ongoing. I think everyone must know what the COP summits are by now. They hit the news so hard whenever they go on. We had one here in Scotland.
I don't know what it is. What is it?
Oh, you don't? Okay. Oh, there we go. So these are like, I'm not even sure actually what COP stands for. It eludes me, but they're like, maybe Marco and Richard know. Do you guys know what COP stands for?
No.
The C is climate. I'll go with that.
Yeah.
I guess that much.
So they're climate change conferences, basically, right? And the governments of all the major nations in the world attend. They're regarded as very, very serious, as kind of, in a sense, the international community planning how we're going to tackle climate change for the future. Trump famously sort of withdrew from the agreement at the one in Paris, which I think was COP25, was it? And then COP26 was here in Scotland, in Glasgow, a few years ago, and everyone was tremendously excited, and Greta Thunberg refused to attend, and all this kind of stuff, right? And so, and they're often critiqued because the people who are very serious about we need to tackle climate change, this is a really serious issue, we need to take it seriously, say that basically the commitments aren't radical enough. And so Greta Thunberg referred to the promises of them, I think, as blah, 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 famously as well. So, and what's interesting about the summit as it's been going on so far is that we've seen, at least reportedly, a toning down of the language. So from one of the previous ones, Daniel's telling me, so the COP stands for the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's a bit of a mouthful. There you go.
An acronym within an acronym?
Yeah, I guess so. There you go.
I'm glad I couldn't recall it now.
Yeah, well, who could recall that? So we've seen a walking back of some of the commitments in a way, and often the commitments, in a sense, are too radical for a lot of governments to really meet feasibly, and so they often don't meet them, and then there's a big outpouring of public kind of anger against politicians. So one of the things that has happened so far this year is that there was a promise to phase out the use of fossil fuels, and that's been done away with. What has become around this time is something like a commitment to reduce usage, things like that. So I actually haven't seen Greta Thunberg's response to this. I have no doubt it's going to be apoplectic, because this is the kind of thing she really rails against, right? But I just wanted to. So I mean, Michael, you haven't heard of COP before, but did you have a little look at this one?
I know about those meetings. I just didn't know that's what they were called.
Oh, okay, sure.
I remember the Paris Climate Accords. I just didn't know they were called COPP with multiple acronyms and all that.
Yeah. So, but what have you had a look at the COP28 so far?
I haven't, but I will say this. First of all, the Paris Accords, because that's the one I know about. The agreement wasn't binding anyway. It's like a promise. Yeah, we'll do it, but no one's enforcing it. So what difference does it make? And I'm generally opposed to these sort of international agreements where all these countries get together and start imposing things on people. Doesn't mean I would never accept one. I out of pure principle, I'm just skeptical of anything that comes out of them or any claims that they make.
Mm-hmm. And so, Mark and Richard, have you guys had a look? And what do you think about the COP summits in general? Because there's something which in a way are very reviled. They're in a sense put on for people who take environmentalism very seriously, but then people who take environmentalism seriously seem to hate the COP conferences, especially since Greta Thunberg has come around. So what do you guys think?
Well, talking about material for conspiracy theory, here we have hundreds of thousands of members of the international elite flying into a place in order to tell us not to fly. I think last year it was in Sharm el Sheikh, of all rough places, there to find themselves in one of the flashiest tourist destinations. This year is in Dubai, and it's hosted by, you know, the Arabs, the UAE, what is it called?
Yeah.
That's the epitome of that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you cannot make up these things. I mean, here you have a conference in order to tell people to use less energy, and you're moving thousands and thousands of people, and in various areas of the world. Well, why, in the first place, you don't do that on a Zoom conference? I mean, who knows? Yeah. And also these international ARCUKs are just, I don't even know. I mean, they're not binding, but for example, just look at our government in Britain. They apply it, and whatever happens, they seem to be impossible to touch. You know, the net zero policy is just there, and there's nothing you can do about it. The government will not do anything to undermine it, which is a bit bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, as Marco demonstrated there, it kind of descends into, it's just hard to even pick out what's wrong with it from beginning to end. I mean, Greta Thunberg at the moment seems to be more diverted by pro-Palestinian anti-Israel marches than her core supposed beef of the environment. But I think one of the things that these things get accused of is the so-called greenwashing criticism, which is people attending a conference, having a big jolly, and then coming up with nothing that satisfied the placard-wielding masses who literally want them to do exactly what they say to the letter, and more so, before they change their demands yet again and make them even more draconian 10 minutes later, so that it would literally be impossible for any conference to meet those demands. I mean, there was an announcement the other day in The Guardian. I think a group of IPCC scientists were talking about the fact that they wanted to impose policy, not just advise on it or come up with scientific advice for green policies, but to actually impose them and have the ability and power to force them on countries around the world that sign up to the IPCC stuff that they shell out. So yeah, it's and at the same time, you've got countries like in the Arab world at the moment where you've got they're trying to organize more oil and gas deals on the sidelines of a conference which supposedly is trying to reduce oil and gas and fossil fuels. Now, you've got to commend them for the fact that that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to promote the proper business aspects of a valid form of warming us and heating us, and the fossil fuels that we all as objectivists would support the use of. But the hypocrisy written into all this is just, well, it's at every level. It's at the level from the streets to the people at the conference to everybody reporting on them in the media. And that does nothing for people's faith and belief and rather confidence in what authorities are telling them, which feeds into the conspiracy theory stuff we were talking about earlier.
One of the thing that happened in the previous one, and I think this one, is about finding an agreement in order to throw some money to countries which are unduly affected, usually small countries or poor countries. It's the usual racket where the West is throwing money to some country which God knows what criteria they're going to use. But the whole thing seems to be making life impossible in the West by being anti-human life, and in order to throw some free cash to some country who's arguing, oh, I'm getting too hot or I'm getting too wet. It's totally rational.
So one of the things, as I said, is there's been an outcry from people about the wording so far, and a lot of that has been from nations in attendance, right? And so there's been poorer nations who seem to have been kind of happy with the wording, but are not saying too much about it because they don't want to be seen as being too bad. Because in effect, if there's a huge if there's an elimination of fossil fuels, they're going to suffer from that because they're very reliant on them. And it seems like island nations which are furious about this because, in their own words, this is signing their death warrant. I suppose they're very worried about rising sea levels, something like that, and that's why they're very concerned. And then you get the major nations being very upset about it as well. But so one, I want to ask, why is there the toning down of the language? Because in a sense, I think what you would probably expect is an intense, given the way the conversation around climate change has been going the last few years, the big stunts you've seen throwing super artwork and all this kind of stuff. I would have expected to see an intensification of the rhetoric, like greater promises to eliminate by X date and so on. Yeah, actually we're seeing a slight easing of that kind of thing. Why do you think that is? I kind of wonder whether Alex Epstein's had an influence. Probably not, but that that's something that you wonder about. But why has this come about? But then also, let's convene our own COP 28.5. What does the world do about fossil fuels, climate change, all this kind of stuff? How do you think people should handle it? So Michael, I'll come to you first.
I think that the reason that the rhetoric has died down, and this is pure obvious speculation on my part, I don't know, but I would bet that it has something to do with the inflation that recently occurred. And when people can't afford fuel and they start to realize how tough it is when you can't afford the fuel that you need for your heating, your air conditioning, your automobile, they start to panic. And the last thing the populace wants to hear is, well, you've got to cut back on your use. And these people are like, whoa, look how much I'm cutting back already. And ultimately, politicians are in the business of staying in office, not in the business of solving problems. So I think that probably has a lot to do with it. I don't think Alex Epstein has had an influence, although I do think that his point is influential. What I mean is that we need these fossil fuels, and people realize it once the fossil fuels are more hard to come by. So that's if I had to guess, I would say that that's why the rhetoric has died down. And as far as what can be done, I don't know. I mean, China's certainly not going to do it. They're not going to cut back. Developing countries who need fossil fuels in order to move into the modern world aren't going to cut back. So, and if just America does it or just Britain does it, that's not going to do anything. And I'm not even convinced that it's all that much of a problem. But granted, I don't know much about the carbon science anyways.
There was, so part of the statistics which came out, which I guess goes to the point that countries like China aren't going to care about this, or they aren't really going to limit themselves, is that in the last 8 years, supposedly, I haven't really looked into the veracity of the statistic, but a statistic that's come out, in the last 8 years, China has put out more CO2 emissions than the whole of Great Britain since 1750. If you think about that, that's crazy. That's more than the whole Industrial Revolution, 20th century. That's mental. So some of the emphasis that's put on Western nations is clearly just, window dressing, really, if you think about that kind of thing. But Mark and Richard, why do you think we're seeing a kind of lessening of the rhetoric around it? And then what can be done?
Well, I love it when reality gives idiocy a great big slap, because that's how it should work, really, isn't it? And what Michael's saying there about the economic reality is definitely at the heart of this. You've got companies like in the UK, Thames Water, for example, a water utility company that serves the southeast region of the UK, dropping their 2030 net zero plans, because if they don't do it, they're about to go bust and about to go under, because all of those impositions of all of those regulations and self-imposed restrictions for meeting this arbitrary 2030 net zero position means that they're unable to economically function and will ultimately go under if they don't abandon it. So they're an example of plenty of other companies that are doing the same. That's why you're seeing a watering down across Europe a lot of the things like electric vehicle deadlines and when they're going to be when you're no longer going to be able to buy a petrol car anymore in Europe or the UK. Those deadlines have been moved back, and it's just facing the truth of it. What can we do about it? What can we do about what exactly? What can we do about the fact that they're talking such rubbish, or the fact that we need to pay some attention to how we improve our environmental and use of resources?
So, like, I have friends who are very passionate about this, and who think we should be investing hugely into nuclear, right? Who are kind of like, who basically think that we should be using fossil fuels for the meantime, but that we should be shifting our main focus into investment in nuclear energy. And they're really irate about the fact that that's not really being taken seriously by Western nations. That there's a huge emphasis on elimination of the use of oil, and then an emphasis on the use of things like renewable energy, like wind, solar, and stuff like that. And especially here in Scotland, right, we have a lot of wind turbines. If you go and drive up to the Highlands, you'll see huge farms of them. And one of my friends who's really into this, like, will pull up the power grid and show me how much they contribute. And it's not an insignificant, it's about 10 or something percent, something like that. And so he thinks, yeah, okay, those have a place, but for kind of the baseline of our energy, we have that coming from nuclear, because the way renewable sources kind of spike and go away, right? They're reliable for a small part of the day and then they go away. But nuclear is steady and it's constant, and it makes about 20-25% of how much energy the UK uses. And he thinks that just basically needs to be upped very much so. And basically he thinks a lot of it is driven around kind of fears related to memories of the power plant. Chernobyl, there you go. Or in Japan, and so on and so forth. And he thinks that a lot of that's basically irrational and fueled by a lack of knowledge. So even if there's problems in the climate change discussion, people coming from it from a wrong perspective, I think there's something legitimate said that can be done about moving away from quite the reliance we have on fossil fuels to some extent.
But in my mind, it's not about relying on fossil fuel. It is that invest in technology. Invest in technology that makes it more efficient, that requires less energy. And about nuclear, I'm not terribly sold. Yes, it seems to be right now the solution, or at least a good solution. But we are so close to fusion now. There are experiments that are really, really promising. So instead of dictating policies by having meetings and writing reams or papers and flying around the globe, put the kind of money and effort into fostering technology, fostering students and technicians and people who can actually make fusion real now, rather than kicking out in the long grass because we're wasting time by having meetings. That's just ludicrous.
And one of the things here is that it goes beyond the single parliament. You need to be thinking proper long term in terms of these energy solutions, and that's precisely what politicians don't do. You've got to look at the irrationality, for example, of Germany after the Fukushima accident in Japan, deciding to stop nuclear power when the accident in Japan is based on a tidal wave. And there are no tidal waves threatening Germany, so it's really stupid to assume that therefore you need to stop your nuclear power stations. Meanwhile, in France, you've got a lot of nuclear power stations that are supposedly coming to the end of their life and haven't been sufficiently maintained and updated and replaced with new ones, which is leading them to, although they've got a large nuclear industry, it's not in as healthy a state as it should be because of the same problem, because of governments not thinking long term and not putting sufficient emphasis on that long-term planning to allow, ideally from an objectivist point of view, private business to go ahead and have the ability to acquire planning permission, acquire the rights to ensure an energy future that can serve the whole of the nation.
So just in terms of super chats, we have $2.99 Canadian from Christopher Schmidt. Thanks so much, Christopher. So I'll come. We've got 5 minutes left, so just maybe any final comments if you have any. We probably haven't solved the climate change debate, just as we tend not to solve the Middle East, but we'll keep trying. Anything final to say about COP28, guys, before we head off?
I have nothing to add.
Yeah, let's hope it's the last one.
Let's hope it's the last one. Sure. I hope they don't come back to Scotland, because they caused a big ruckus last time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They seem to come around rather often, almost as often as Black History Month or some such event. But yeah, and I don't know whether climate change is the conspiracy theory that we were talking about at the beginning, or whether they overlap or not, or whether it's a response to it that overlaps. Who can say at the end of it? It's just, just keep your eyes and ears open and consider it all in the round.
We'll have to see. And one of the things that I'm going to be keeping an eye out for is what Greta Thunberg has to say about this, because I just had a quick look, and she's like you said, I think, Richard, she's been in the news pretty much solely for Gaza activism in the last few weeks, and actually said pretty much nothing that's made the headlines around this summit. So I'm going to keep an eye out for what she has to say, because I presume she's going to have to say something, and that might be interesting. But
and let's know what we think until we hear from her. So
how some people are conspiracy theorists, other people rely on authority. We have to listen to Greta, who's our authority, right? All right, guys.
She's young, so I'm glad she's found a new area of interest.
For sure. All right, guys.
Take care, guys.
All right, thank you. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.